Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, and again, my name is Tynes. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy and Regulatory Counsel for SolarCity Corporation. I hope everyone had a nice Halloween and didn't damage themselves too much with too much sugar over the last few days. Also, I just want to initially thank the Center for Next Generation Photovoltaics for the opportunity to present today, especially Kristen Fine, the Center's Innovation Director, asked me to do this. I really appreciate that. And Sean, the Center's Administrator, has been a great help, and I can see makes these webinars run real smoothly, so thanks to them. So let's get to it. The outline of the presentation will be as follows. I'll just start out with a quick intro of SolarCity, what the company does, what its goals are, what I do for that company. And then I will, the focus of the presentation is, regulatory proceedings and policy issues that I've had to deal with throughout the country. And I'll talk some about Texas, but we'll talk about a lot of other jurisdictions as well. But before I get into that, just wanted to talk generally about what the policy issues are for electric utilities, for solar, and the economics and sort of structures in place around those entities. And then we'll get into the actual proceedings themselves. So I spend most of my time working on rate cases, and it's basically an administrative law proceeding that normally takes place at public utility commissions or public service commissions. And we'll get into that deeper, but those can really determine the economic outcome of distributed generation solar in very dramatic ways. And then I'll go on to talk about the precedents that those can create, which means essentially they will establish rules or trends for how all utilities within the service area will then compensate end-use distributed generation solar customers for their contributions to the grid. And then, of course, the last part of that that's still dealt with at the state agency level is a rulemaking, which, by its very nature sets policy that has blanket effects on all utilities. Of course, obvious policy comes from state legislatures, but also local ordinances from cities and counties at times can have a great effect on, whether an end-use customer can even place solar or interconnect it whatsoever. And which, of course, naturally leads to interconnection policies, which are generally utility policies. Interestingly, there are a couple of state constitutional elections that are on the ballot that will have a tremendous effect on the economics of solar and the ability for individuals to go solar who want to. So I'll talk about a couple of those, namely Florida and Nevada, which have a couple of really hotly contested and they're getting a lot of coverage in the media these days. And then before concluding, just wanted to talk a little bit about political communication. The communications and the messaging around solar, I think a lot of times gets bogged down in political rhetoric and picks one side or the other of the aisle. So wanted to talk a little bit about that, about how there are ways to, I think, straddle both and to make sense of the promotion of distributed solar generation to both sides of the aisle, and how people can participate in that, even if they're not attorneys, even if they're not lobbyists, even if they're not folks with particular political interests, because really everybody in the community could have a say in this and could help to promote solar generation, not just distributed, but of course utility scale as well. And of course, then I'll conclude and open it up for questions. So SolarCity, as many of you likely know, is chaired by Elon Musk. He invented PayPal. He's also the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX. And really, the goal of the company, it's an environmentally conscious company that wants to do what it can to try to mitigate the effects of climate change as quickly as possible. And the key part of SolarCity in doing that was to basically paper all rooftops with distributed generation solar by making it affordable. In Texas, we have recently expanded into Austin, Dallas-Fort Worth, Richardson, Houston, and El Paso. We opened up in Austin about a month ago, a little more than a month ago. So, of course, I have to give the plug if anybody wants to go solar. We are here in Austin now. and also serve the surrounding communities as well. So getting back to the general purpose of SolarCity, the goal was to try to make it as affordable as possible, meaning solar energy. And so we try to offer that at a lower cost than what customers are normally paying for their energy by burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. So it had to be a high-quality product. We couldn't go cheap, even though the goal was to save folks money. And so what we've done is created ways for individuals to save money. SolarCity really got its footing by creating what is known as the solar lease, which is where the company would literally give the end-use customer solar panels to lease or borrow or rent for a monthly payment. And that would offset the customer's bill a certain amount, but the amount that the customer would pay for the lease was even less than that. So, for example, it could, ostensibly cut the end-use customer's bill by $50 a month, and then the customer would only pay $30 a month for those solar panels. The economics were so good that, who could say no to that? The company is based in California, where volumetric electric rates are a lot higher than they are here in Texas. So, that was easier to do. It's easier to offset and to provide value to end-use customers when the price of electricity is a lot higher. And so taking economics into account, that's really how we had explosive growth of solar, especially in California and in other communities. It's starting to grow more and more. So the solar lease was the first method of doing that. And now a lot of companies have also made it to where you can buy them and you can pay them off over the long term and get that comparable monthly benefit, because a lot of people wanted to own their solar systems. And so there's now financing mechanisms to do that as well. One thing that's unique to SolarCity is that we really wanted to do every single aspect of the product and the service. So if you decide that you want to go solar with SolarCity, we'll do everything from selling it to financing it, of course designing it on your roof, installing it on your roof, and then controlling the applications that you can use to monitor that. And then you can provide additional energy efficiency services. So you can all go to one place to get everything. So that said, the economics have to be right. The economics have to make sense. And so that's a lot of what the policy division, which is the team that I work for, does. And we ensure that, one, solar customers, when they do go solar, that they're compensated fairly for the surplus energy that they put on the grid. And this is something that we do in those rate cases that I referred to previously, and I'll dig into a little bit later. Secondarily, we have to make sure that solar customers are treated fairly and equitably in those proceedings, and that they're not discriminated against, namely, that they're not isolated within rate design, and that they're not assigned higher costs arbitrarily. And again, I'll get further into that as I talk about rate cases on that later slide. And then the final thing is just to make sure that lots of the smaller things that can just get in the way to allow people to go solar don't. There can be really problematic local permitting restrictions, just a random array of prohibitions, tax liabilities taking place. So we take all these things into account and work with local governments, state governments, administrative agencies, even the federal government, to make sure that not only are we having a good product out there, but that at the end of the day, economically, it makes sense. So economics is key. Someone who is actually a very strong solar proponent these days is Barry Goldwater Jr., former congressman. And he talks about all the time about how when solar panels sort of first came on the scene, they were huge and they were bulky and they weren't that efficient and they cost a lot. And you started to see their applications really with space satellites. They would have these huge arrays that would only power very small electronics. As time has gone on, the efficiencies have gone up, and so panels are now much more affordable. But really, what that shows and what that gets down to is that we're going in the right direction on cost. But really, the key part of the thing is that a lot of folks for the longest time, if they were going to go solar, it was just because they had a very strong environmental concern and they had enough money to do it. They had money to play with. But for most folks, you can be as environmentally conscious as you want. But if you have to choose between, paying your bills, your personal economics, and being environmentally conscious, well, people they're going to take care of what they need to at minimum. So that is what, thankfully, progress and time and economics and setting up structures to make it affordable have helped with, so that everybody can go solar and everybody can help out with the problem. So as I mentioned, solar hard costs have gone down. And then there are things that also help. The federal solar investment tax credit has been a tremendous help. As many of you likely know, you can get a 30% tax credit on your solar investment, which is tremendous, a great cost savings. Lots of local jurisdictions, like Austin Energy, for example, will give you a rebate to where if you install solar on your roof and meet their criteria, you will get a rebate per each watt installed. That, combined with the federal solar tax credit, really makes this very affordable for folks and allows them to see savings on their electric utility bill at the end of the month. Now, all those two things are good, but again, as I mentioned previously, we have to make sure that these two things are also taken care of. That export compensation, meaning that when a solar customer puts energy out on the grid, they're compensated for that. And two, that when they are billed, that they're not so high that the idea and the option of going solar is just cost prohibitive. So general considerations before we get into the specific policy area. So utilities are going to be a key player for the time being. Now, current technology means that everybody has to interconnect to their utility, unless that end-use customer wants to go totally off-grid. If they have a lot of solar and they have a lot of storage and batteries, and they have the money, frankly, to do that, they can go off-grid. But really, we're not quite there yet. We will probably get there eventually, but we're not there yet. Utilities are still going to very much play a role in this transformation. And frankly, they may even play an increased role in this transformation as perhaps we move to creating more electricity from renewable resources and get away from traditional resources like coal and natural gas, especially for transportation. So there are types of utilities, and they all have different characteristics, if you will. In Texas, of course, because we've got ERCOT and our unique grid, we are a little more complicated. We have basically three types of utilities, if you will. The first one is the one that you see in most jurisdictions throughout the United States, the vertically integrated utility. So in Texas, these are the ones that are actually just outside of ERCOT on the edges of the state. So El Paso Electric, the very far west. SWEPCO and SPS, those are in the very far north and northeastern part of the state. Sharyland is at the southernmost portion of the state, and Entergy is just to the east of Houston. So vertically integrated utilities, they have all aspects of it built into the utility service. So that means it's the power plant, the generators. It's the transmission, the transportation part of it, which is the poles and the wires that move the energy from the power plant to the end-use customer. And then, of course, the last part, which is the sort of the retail function that actually deals with the end-use customers and deals with customer service. So vertically integrated utility does all three of those. Now, once you get within ERCOT, each three of those elements have actually been separated out and they actually must be separate companies. So when you hear the word utility or T&D utility sometimes, in ERCOT, they're really only referring to the transportation part of the equation. So the common ones are Encore, which is like just north of Austin and serves all the way up to the Dallas area, and CenterPoint, which is again the wires and poles company that's in the Houston area. When you're in this part of the territory, within ERCOT, within restructured or deregulated ERCOT, the role of the retail electric provider, which is the entity that deals with the end-use customer, is also very important to determine that solar export compensation that we were talking about, because the customer has a contract with them, and that determines what that customer is going to pay on their rates, but also what they'll be compensated. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but just one thing, the only reason I bring that up is to point out that when you are in deregulated or restructured ERCOT, there are a few more players to deal with than if you're just a vertically integrated utility. Or, and the last option, which is if you are in a cooperative or municipally owned utility. Those function similarly to vertically integrated utilities, and that really is just a one-stop shop. There's only one entity that you're dealing with. And examples are Proceedings Electric Cooperative directly to the west of Austin, and of course, Austin Energy, where we are. So let's get into rate cases. So why does the solar industry care about rate cases? Again, it's all about economics, and those are tremendously affected here. What we do in a rate case is basically the utility proves up the prudence of its expenses, and then it plans out how it's going to recover those over a period of time and from who. A funny analogy that I once heard about rate cases is it's a lot like going to a restaurant, a big fancy restaurant with a lot of your friends who are feeling extremely cheap on this evening. And so what happens is the check arrives and some of your friends dispute the bill. They say, well, hey, no, we didn't order that, or we didn't need that, or we didn't want that, or we didn't like that. That is the first part of a rate case, and all those people are basically the different types of rate payers. So some are like the industrial customers, some are commercial customers, some are the residential customers. And they're all in different classes, and they can intervene in this case, and then they can dispute it. So that is sort of challenging the revenue requirement. So then imagine, okay, restaurant or the utility says, okay, fine, we'll reduce the bill by this amount. Then the check comes. And then all the parties who have to pay the check then agree who pays what. So commercial entities and residential entities a lot of times don't think that they should pay for upgrades or investments that the utility made that perhaps didn't directly benefit them. Or sometimes industrial customers who can take voltage at a much higher rate, so they can basically get like sort of just a direct pipeline from the generator. They don't feel like they should have to pay for the costs that are all sort of downstream from them. So this is a principle that you hear a lot in rate cases when it's sort of who pays for what. It's the idea of cost causation, or who's using it, who is benefiting from it, or to go to the restaurant analogy, who ate or drank what that made up that check. So let's talk a little bit about what that utility is investing in and what it's trying to recover money from, and then what it's going to bill its end-use customers for. So utilities, they get a monopoly. They get an exclusive right to serve an area within a certain territory. Now, in exchange, they get a return on investment, and they get that exclusive right to serve the area, but they're also obligated to serve all those customers in that area. Now, it's capital intensive. Utility has to front a lot of the costs and a lot of the money to build very large, heavy, complicated infrastructure. So, the only reason that they're going to do that is it's going to be sort of under a loan or a banking model, right? So put up the upfront cost, but they're going to recover that with some return over time. Now, the return is established somewhat vaguely. In the law, whenever you see the word reasonable, that generally means that there's room to argue. So the Public Utility Regulatory Act, which governs utilities in Texas, basically says that utilities have a reasonable opportunity to earn their authorized return, but it doesn't guarantee it, nor does it say what that return is. So a lot of times in a rate case, the profit margin that the utility will make on top of what they could recover is oftentimes a huge source of debate. And so one key thing to note before we go forward is that utility, so if you look at your electric bill, the bulk of it is going to be your volumetric rates. How much electricity did you use during that time period? But then there are other parts of it, such as taxes and fees. But then the last part is the one that can be problematic, which is fixed costs, and they can be very high. And those are not affected by how much electricity you use. They're just there every time. And so there's been a trend for utilities to increase the fixed costs, thus discouraging participation in energy efficiency or solar in some instances. And we'll get into that too as the rate case slide comes about. So I like this slide because it shows sort of everything that goes into getting your electricity. So if you're here, this is the power plant, the generation. I kind of wish this was bigger because that's really one of the most tremendous investments that you can have. Power plants, they're huge. They require tons of investment, tons of siting, tons of expenses. And they're a massive part of the bill that the end-use customer is eventually going to pay. But the reason I like this is because it really shows transmission. So this is, again, the pipeline from A to B. So how do we get the energy from here all the way across, empty land to industrial customers, lighter industry and commercial customers, and then home. And so this shows that there's tremendous amounts of investments here in this part of the grid or of the utility system that we all pay for. And the reason I want to depict this is because if you think about what distributed generation solar is, it means that if it's satisfying all electrical needs, we could possibly cut this, we could possibly cut all of this or reduce it, right? And it's all here. We're all sort of servicing and generating at the point of consumption. This image, by the way, I got this from Texas Instruments, and I believe they stole it from someone else, but just wanted to provide that citation. So one key thing that we've been seeing in rate cases, and it's something that folks should be aware of, is there are specific moves to increase charges just to solar customers. One example that we saw in an Arizona co-op tried to raise the fixed customer charge on customers from $10 to $50, so literally a 5-fold increase. And again, that fixed charge, that's the amount that you can't change. You can't mitigate that. It shows up on your bill every single time. So you can imagine if you're a solar customer and you're saving money on your bills from using less electricity because you're generating your own and you're exporting some and being compensated for it. If there's this fixed charge on there, there's that $50 that you can never quite reduce, so it can really affect you. And to bring it home to Texas, in El Paso, there was a recent proposal in its initial application. It wanted to put solar customers, which are normally just in the regular residential class, or residential solar customers are anyways. It wanted to put them in a separate class, and then it wanted to double their rate. And then it came out with a later proposal where then it just wanted to increase its fixed fees by about $11 just on solar customers. And luckily, the solar advocates were able to defeat that. But had that passed, it would have been very difficult for solar, especially distributed generation solar, to be successful in that service area. So these are the arguments that you'll oftentimes hear. A lot of times folks say, well, look, solar customers, because they're paying less on their bills, they're not paying for their fair share of the cost of the grid. Now, this is related to the issue that I flagged earlier in that utilities recover most of their revenue through volumetric rates. So the more electricity a customer uses, the more revenue the utility receives. And the utilities for years have been modeling their projected revenue based upon how much electricity somebody's going to use. But now people are using less because of solar electricity. And so sometimes utilities, and opponents of distributed generation solar, they blame it all on distributed solar generation. They call it the disruptor, and they say that it's not contributing sufficiently. But if you think about everything that's on the distributed grid, and all the types of entities and homes and small commercial entities, what they're doing, they all have dramatically different effects on the grid. So for example, I think it's disingenuous to say that solar is the only disruptor, the only one that could possibly reduce revenues here. Because for example, what about vacant properties? Think about a home that just sits there, or a small like corner store, or gas station that is vacant. The utility spent money wiring that home or that property, and those are fixed costs that are basically sunk for it. So, because that customer then is not receiving a utility bill and they're not using any electricity. So could you not then say that that property is not paying its fair share? I think you could. What about snowbirds? Folks that during the summer, when the electric peak is actually the highest, they leave. They leave their homes vacant. So again, there's no use, similar to the vacant properties. And then, of course, energy efficiency, which is great. But, the thing is as efficiency gets better, as new homes get better, as appliances get better, people are using less. And so there's a need, obviously, for utilities to figure out a way to get revenue other than through end-use customers just utilizing more kilowatt hours. But it can't just all go to penalizing solar customers. So the other issue that we get into quite a bit is the issue of export compensation. So if I've got solar on my home, and if I'm not using what it's generating, I can then export that out onto the grid, and my neighbor could benefit from it. So a lot of times the question is, well, how do we compensate the end-use customer for that? A lot of states, just for the sake of simplicity, just use what's called net metering or net energy metering. So if I export 1 kilowatt hour, somebody else consumes that, then I will be credited 1 full kilowatt hour on my bill. And this has actually been the backbone of a lot of distributed generation solar companies' economics, because it's easy. It's a one-to-one offset. Lots of companies know how to use it. It makes sense. But there's been a lot of attack as to that it's not a very scientific approach to valuing what distributed generation solar exports are actually worth. And so you've gotten a lot of push within rate cases or with rulemakings to try to determine what it's valued as, to argue that it's less. Sorry, that's a little bit more on net metering, and I think probably folks on here have a good grasp of it. But trying to explain it to end-use customers can be pretty difficult sometimes. But one thing to note is that net metering, I think, is generally fair, because if you think about it, when 1 kilowatt hour is exported and it goes out onto the grid, and then another customer consumes it, that other customer's meter spins as if it were a kilowatt hour generated by the utility. And the utility bills for that, even though that utility didn't create that energy, didn't transmit that energy. The only thing the utility did to help facilitate that was actually provide the distributed grid to move the electrons from point A to point B. So given that the utility can pay the customer that consumes it for a full kilowatt hour, shouldn't the customer that created it be credited that? So some parties have proposed reducing it to what the retail rate is, arguing that it's not worth that because the full retail rate that the utility has to prove up through its rate case includes all of those components of the system that I pointed out earlier. It includes generation, it includes transmission, it includes all these things that utilities have to take into account to get that final product to the customer. So the argument is, well, since it didn't go through all those steps, shouldn't we just pay then the avoided cost of power or the wholesale cost of what the utility would pay to buy electricity generally? Now the problem with that is that you can't claim that just because the energy was produced over there at the point of the source that it's not worth the full retail rate, because again, it's satisfying the end-use needs of the customer, and it didn't have to go through all those steps. So to a degree, it was more efficient, it was more effective. It shouldn't be, its value shouldn't be reduced because of that. Sort of the example is when you're saying, I'm paying for, for bread at the wheat price. The wheat is only a part of that, but if the end-use customer goes to the store and they buy bread, well, they just buy the bread, and at the full rate, and then, whether it went through all the other steps of processing or if it was made some other way, then that's not really relevant to the end-use cost of it. And we'll get into this a little bit later as well, but, studies in lots of states, including Vermont, Nevada, Mississippi, they all showed that net metered electricity, distributed generation solar actually provides benefits to all customers that actually exceed those than what traditional generated electricity does. And in several analyses, businesses and individuals that go solar, it was shown they actually deliver greater benefits to the grid and to society than they actually receive through net metering. And that's from a recent Environment America study. And of course, there are other elements, reducing climate impacts, water conservation, generation of electricity uses tremendous amounts of water. So if we take that into account, it's important. But also it adds to resiliency to the power system, and it creates public health benefits through clean air and things related to that nature. One other thing that I'll probably point out again a little bit later, but when you're in deregulated or restructured ERCOT, there are now several retail electric providers. The one that we pair up with is a company called MP2. So if you wanted to get SolarCity and you're just north of Austin Energy and you're in the Encore service area, you would contact MP2 to be your rep. And they actually offer full retail net metering, and they're not required to at all. So, how is that? I think that shows that the fact that the retailers, and MP2 isn't the only one, have figured out a way to make a business case for offering full retail net metering, meaning that they're granting full retail compensation to end customers who export their solar energy. It means that there's value in that beyond that. It means that players within the energy system can hedge. So following up on that, I think there are lots of arguments out there to show that the value of distributed generation solar is significant. And I point this out because I think there's a lot of sentiment out there that it's not, that distributed generation solar is just a drop in the bucket, that it's, not really helping out that much. But I would have to disagree with that, and I think that most people should if they really think about it, because if we're generating or we're consuming at the point of the source, we really reduce the need for all of that generation, massive investments there, and transmission, the massive investments there. And I just want to point out this isn't trashing utilities or large-scale generation or transmission. They've been the bedrock, frankly, of modern society, and they will continue to be needed even if we have more renewable generation. But the point is that it's a significant and substantial piece of the puzzle that shouldn't be devalued and derided. If anything, we need to grow that. Because if you really think about it, if you start to ignore distributed generation or any sort of distributed energy resource, then it causes planning for the utility system to be redundant. And then that creates unnecessary costs for all. If you go back to that rate case, those are costs that we're all going to pay for. Another thing to consider is that solar oftentimes generates at times of the highest demand on the system. And the next slide that I'll show you will really point this out. But the highest demand on the system is normally the hottest day in the summer. And so everybody gets home, everybody cranks their AC, turns the TV on, they do whatever. And if you think about it, think about the strain that puts on power plants, the strain that puts on transmission lines when everybody all of a sudden has to pump that from the generator through the transmission lines, through the substation, to their home. So if you're generating out there at the source of consumption, you're really helping to reduce the stress on the grid. And so that said, in certain jurisdictions, you actually do see utilities and distributed generation entities working together to plan out long-term planning for how they're going to plan for future energy and system needs. A recent and really great example is in California. California ISO recently canceled 13 transmission projects and said that they could be replaced by solar DG and energy efficiency, which would save just short of $200 million. So again, it's a different way of thinking, right? It's taking resources out there at the point of consumption and applying them, but it's not as micro as it looks. It's actually in a way that truly benefits the entire system. Now, I stole this slide from my friend Charlie Hemline at Texas Solar Power Association. He's got his star there in the corner. But what this shows is the difference of the usage on the grid a certain amount of time. So this here is a day in March. This is actually March 2015. Temperature was fairly low, 69 degrees, and we're only using about 33,000 megawatts. ERCOT's not too worried right now at this point. But now this is the hottest day in the summer here. This was August 10th, 2015. 70,000 megawatts. That's almost twice over here. Now, look at where the biggest jump is. It's residential. And all of these homes could have solar panels on their rooftops. So could small commercial. And actually, industrial customers are also doing it as well. But if you want to look at the traditional distributed generation, this huge block that puts this tremendous strain on ERCOT could greatly be reduced if they all had solar on the roofs, or most of them had solar on the roofs, and they were just trading electrons to the distributed grid. This is the scariest day right here for ERCOT every year, because they don't know if all the power plants that are far off will work, will any of them trip off, will they have problems. And then all those parts of the system in between, will they fail? Will there be any problem? And you know, they're prone to that. And again, it's a network. You know, sometimes ambitious squirrels and birds have caused entire distribution or transmission grid to go down. You know, when the weather is actually the worst, it puts the worst strain on generation and transmission infrastructure. When it's very cold, you see lots of frost on power lines. When it's very hot, you see the lines start to sag, and you get lots of losses there. So this is a huge reason in showing why having generation out on the distributed grid is huge, and it's tremendous, and it can really help with potential problems. So when we get into it, you know, what are we going to value exports? A lot of times we want to break out the value of each entity or each aspect of the equation, I guess, if you will. And so a lot of times we're proving up negative. It's you know, what did we avoid? You know, did we avoid the purchase of additional fuel? Did we avoid the need to build new transmission lines, like the California example I gave you just a little while ago? But then some other ways that you can really think about it, and it's just up to you whether you want to quantify it. There's not any reason not to, but a lot of times people don't. You know, they don't quantify this. It's a hedge. You know, it's more reliability. It's another source. It's part of the all of the above energy policy to have more resources out on the grid to harden it, to make it safer. And then grid resiliency also. You know, if you decentralize the grid, the risks of electromagnetic pulses or any sort of attack on a substation or anything like that, they're reduced because you've got energy coming from more sources on the distributed grid. One that I find very frustrating that people don't really take into account is, you know, the environmental compliance costs, which I think they should, and actually more so as environmental benefits, which I wish they would take into account more so. And that's what this is right here. You know, somehow in rate cases, when we're talking about the value of distributed generation, these aspects, you know, they don't get considered at all. But if you really think about what the costs are of keeping air cleaner, the jobs that are created, you know, and the benefits they're tremendous. But another thing too is just, you know, if you can avoid transmission, you can avoid also CCN transmission proceedings. CCN stands for Certificate of Convenience and Necessity. And whenever a utility wants to build out more transmission, it's normally a really large, heavily litigated case that's very contentious. And so if you can avoid that, you can avoid having to, you know, condemn people's land and use eminent domain, why not? This slide shows several studies that pointed out the conclusions as to what is the value of distributed generation solar. So that's the pink here, and then what the retail rate was there. So as you can see, most studies actually showed that distributed generation solar was worth more than the retail rate. But in spite of that, we don't have that outcome always. We don't always get that outcome. Some commissions have reduced the value of export valuations, unfortunately. in spite of the fact that they have evidence in the record going the other way. So if and when that does happen, and this has been our fallback position, we always have to fight for grandfathering. What that means, what grandfathering means, is that if I bought my solar system in 2005 and I had budgeted and calculated for that investment because I thought I was going to have net metering, then I should be able to continue to have that, and my rates shouldn't change. The rug shouldn't be pulled out from under me. This is very much a protection against retroactive changes or ex post facto laws or changes in contracts that end-use customers have relied on. Luckily, most commissions have been with us on this. Nevada was an example that didn't. Nevada was a really bad outcome for distributed generation solar because the commission said, okay, even if you bought a system in 2005 and you had all these expectations and all this reliance on your economics being this for the long term, sorry, but they're going to change. Thank goodness Nevada went back on that, and they did grandfather customers that had solar before they changed the export values. So luckily those customers will have the value in their investments that they had anticipated and prepared for. But, and we've seen that supported also in Arizona in recent cases, thank goodness. So I just want to talk a little bit about precedent. So, you know, you might say, all right, well, so a rate case in El Paso or a rate case in Nevada, Arizona, why do I care? Because the thing is that they create precedent. Other commissions will look at these and they'll say, all right, what did this state do? What did this utility do? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. It's more efficient to see what parties did in these other, you know, hard-fought cases. And so, you know, what you want to do is you want to win it right. So for anybody out there who, you know, wants to play a role in this, you can really just, at minimum, provide comments and participate and pay attention, because at least you now know sort of what the basic aspects are. You know, don't let solar customers be overcharged, one, and two, make sure that they're compensated fairly for their contribution to the grid. The other way that utility commissions will deal with this is that, you know, they can just make a rule. So, you know, legislatures in certain states have created net metering, and that establishes export valuation. But administrative agencies can also make a rule. So one example of a jurisdiction I've worked in is Louisiana. You know, it has full retail net metering, which is great, but it has a cap on it. It's a very low cap, less than 1% of the demand of the utility. And at this point, every utility has hit that cap. So we're sort of at we're sort of at a loss. We don't know what customers should be compensated at now that those caps have been hit. And a lot of times those caps were created throughout the country to just see, you know, just to make sure that utility systems and the grid would be okay and safe and sound as distributed solar continued to grow. And we've seen in jurisdictions like in Hawaii where literally you had 33% rather than 0.5. You know, the systems were fine. But again, it was just sort of people treading carefully. But so in jurisdictions where rules maybe haven't caught up, where you have enough solar now to where they've hit caps, you know, they need to catch up and they need to update the rules to raise those caps, or you know, just allow basically net metering in the perpetuity, or allow for long-term planning to plug that in, because really that's part of the value that solar needs to proliferate. Just a similar example here for folks who may pay attention to Arizona, because it's somewhat of a hotbed issue on this. They recently had a rule wanting to value solar across the board. It's a tough issue, you know. You can read articles on it. It doesn't seem like any party was really quite happy with what Arizona did with that. So legislation. The other way that we get policy, of course, the much more obvious one, and if you saw Charlie's proceeding, he talked a little bit about RPSs, renewable portfolio standards, meaning that jurisdictions must have a certain amount of renewables within their portfolios. You know, they're helpful, but they're less helpful now. And in Texas, we used a lot of it for wind rather than solar. And so there's not really any left for solar now. But luckily, economics are good enough. I bring up consumer protection because sometimes opponents of solar energy use this term consumer protection to basically just create complications and hurdles for companies. It basically just requires them to jump through lots of hoops and do things that they don't need to do or create lots of red tape or problems for them. And they're smart to couch it as consumer protection because everybody supports consumer protection, taking care of their end-use customers. But when there's an allegation and that's not done, it's very hard to combat against. One thing to note is that every Solar Energy Industry Association member has to follow a solar business code. And they came up with those from lots of folks in the industry, and I think they even consulted with several attorney generals throughout the country. And they make sure that customers are taken care of. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some solar companies out there that have been bad behaviors, but we shouldn't let a few of them cause bad problems for lots of other folks. So just one thing to look at, when you see that term consumer protection thrown around, be a little weary as it relates to solar companies. And then third-party ownership is a really big deal. And as I mentioned at the outset of my presentation, what that means is basically leasing or PPAs, purchase power agreements, which means that the company still owns the solar system, and then they will lease it to you at a rate that you can afford over the long run. And Florida, for example, the Sunshine State, doesn't allow for this, and so you don't really see that much. Solar there as much as it should have. So local ordinances and governments, cities and towns and counties, can throw up some issues as well. The big ones are siting. Can you have your solar panels on the front of your house? Well, if the front of your house faces south-southwest, where you're going to get the most sun resource, I hope you can. Homeowners associations. Luckily, there's a statute in Texas that doesn't allow them to unreasonably restrict your placement, but that doesn't necessarily take care of the problem if the town or the municipality does. So something to take care of there. And then, of course, just extensive permitting can just be problematic really for any company. And the last part is just interconnection. Can you connect to your utility in a timely fashion? Let's say you get your solar system, you sign your contract, and then the utility won't interconnect you, or they won't get your meter going. So one thing that we've been able to do in some jurisdictions is just to make sure that there's reasonable timing to interconnect that customer so that they can enjoy the benefits of their system. And one thing I wanted to flag for folks in Texas, and something that, again, everybody can weigh in on, at the Texas PUC, they are considering what's called the DG interconnection rule, and this will allow additional avenues for basically solar companies to help end-use customers go solar. It helps them with the contracting and the interconnection process, and it just makes the process simpler for end-use customers because it's very complicated for them. So I just raised that to say that there is a way that you can support a rule in Texas that's positively. Constitutional elections are something that we started to see a lot of lately. So in Florida, there's this really interesting battle going on right now, where basically opponents of distributed generation solar proactively put an amendment on the ballot to make folks think that they were supporting distributed generation solar when, as you can see from all these publications I've cited here, it's just the exact opposite. And I love that the New York Times cited that unions, environmental groups, solar energy suppliers, and Jimmy Buffett oppose the measure, which don't want to oppose Jimmy Buffett in Florida. But, the language seems to suggest that it's going to promote solar when it had the exact opposite effect. The good news is that just yesterday, the Miami Herald stated that this proposition is actually 20 points down from likely passing. But opponents of DG Solar have ramped up the campaign. So if you've got friends, family in Florida, let them know, vote no on Proposition 1. It is not what it seems to be. But I flag that because, we're starting to see that as an additional avenue, not just a rate case, not just rulemaking, not just legislation, but heck, entities are even trying to amend constitutions now to get certain policy that is negative towards distributed generation solar. And you've got to be aware of that. Nevada is sort of an example of the opposite. Nevada is considering whether to deregulate its electric market in the way that Texas does. And my boss, John Wellinghoff, is a huge supporter of that. He was also the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And, he thinks that the way, if we can open this up, it actually allows for more options in the way that it's worked in Texas. And so it'll be interesting to see this outcome in Nevada as it possibly amends its constitution to allow for competition. In Nevada, it only has basically the vertically integrated utilities that I talked about at the outset. Oh, and opponents have said that it could affect reliability. Again, look at Texas. We've got the most deregulated market, and it's not an issue. ERCOT keeps reliability on top, as does FERC and NERC. So, let me back up. So just to conclude, when you're out and about and you may hear sort of communications, messaging, talking points on this sort of thing, I think for a lot of folks that are proponents of distributed generation solar or any solar, any renewables really, environmental factors is a key. It makes it a no-brainer for you. So, if necessity was the mother of invention, there was a need to protect the environment, then we should have invented all renewables by this point. We should all be pro-renewable. We should have as many renewables on the grid as possible. But that's obviously not the case. And maybe it's because, we can't see the effects of climate change as quickly from point A to point B as we'd like, even though I think the science is out and for the most part settled on. But you can't just always go in and argue about the environment. But the good news is that there are other things that are truthful, that are honest, that actually make just as much sense for why you should go solar. And so I often, in more conservative jurisdictions, I talk about economics, because that's what's important. Solar now makes economic sense. And not only at the utility scale level, which is competing with natural gas and coal, which is really exciting, but also at the distributed level for the end-use customer. And I, of course, previously talked about all the benefits that it has. Energy freedom, this is a big one for sort of folks that are more libertarian-minded. A lot of folks don't like the idea of a monopoly utility. You don't have the choice to who you buy energy from. You have to buy it from this one entity. What if I could just generate it myself? Sort of this independence notion and self-sufficiency as well. Folks that have concerns about national security, electromagnetic pulses, sort of attacks on the grid from potential terrorists and enemies. Distributed generation solar helps to do that because you're decentralizing the grid. And so, they say politics makes strange bedfellows, but you may have heard of the Tea Party in American politics, where there's also this entity called the Green Tea Party, which is very intensely conservative Tea Party advocates that are also environmentally conscious, but they care about renewables for all these reasons, and they're not the ones that traditionally, sort of more liberal voters and politicians may care about, which is the environment. So there are lots of ways to talk about this and to get your message across the goal line. And one thing to note is that even though in Texas our Public Utility Commission is not elected, in lots of other southern states they are. And so to the extent that you want to go in and you want to participate and you want to just provide comments, you don't have to intervene, you don't have to lawyer up, you don't have to do that full process, but to the extent that you just want to be, make your voice heard, you can, and that's important because it's democracy. They're elected by you in some instances. So, and I know I'm running a little over time here, but a lot of folks say that there's a cost shift, meaning that if you've got distributed generation solar, you're not paying your fair share of the bill like we talked about earlier. But that's just not true because you're benefiting the grid. And it's not that other customers are having to pick up a tab that you're not paying. It's just simply not the case because you're saving. And net metering or a fair export compensation is also not a subsidy. If you think about it, it's just figuring out how we're going to value distributed generation solar. It's not, boosting it with a credit or anything like that. And there are lots of subsidies for other fuel sources out there. So when people drop that, if you want to say, look, let's just eliminate all subsidies, then we can talk. A lot of times that'll shut down that conversation. So in conclusion, and I'm sorry I went a little long, John, it's hard to say, the chair of my company is obviously very environmentally concerned, as is the CEO, Lyndon Ryan. And I heard them at the end of an earnings call once talk to several financial reports saying, look, I mean, you can take all these sort of financial concerns into account, but does that matter if climate change is real? And so, yeah, so there's this debate as to whether climate change is real. But even if there's a 1% chance, just 1%, that climate change is real, shouldn't we do everything that we can to try to mitigate that? Because it's not like there's like some other planet that we can go to, at least not yet. And it's not like there's a plan B. So the economics make sense now. And really for the sake of the environment, it ought to make sense now. So there's not really any reason not to promote that. We can get in the weeds on these issues and rate cases and things like that to not make it economic. But what we've been fighting is to make sure that it is. So anyways, that's all I have. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk, and happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Tommy. That was a great talk. It looks like there was one comment in the chat window. I know you probably can't see it just yet, but Doug and another individual both wanted to thank you for an excellent talk.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all.
One question from one of the students here at UT.
Hey, great talk. I really appreciate you coming and sharing this with us. This was great. So I just, half for class, half for my own entertainment, I've been reading a little bit about Amory. I've been reading a little bit of work from Amory Lovins. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how distributed utility, solar, wind, and other distributed generation sources are going to affect utilities in the future. Are utilities of the future going to be able to operate in the current business model they operate today, or is it going to be more of a distributed utility system or a microgrid utility system?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's on a lot of people's mind. You may have heard in the writings on this, the term death spiral. And it's a very dramatic term, but, it sort of seems to suggest that the utilities are going to be sort of stuck holding the bag because new technology is going to make that, it's going to basically, going to be the Netflix of the Blockbuster, right? Or the cell phones of the Southwestern Bells. I don't think that we're quite there yet, mostly because we haven't figured out a way to wirelessly transmit electricity. We still have to have wires and poles, and that's a huge part. That's a huge part of it. And actually, Elon Musk recently, when he just did the unveiling of the new solar roof and the Powerwall 2, he even said utilities are actually probably going to be a big partner in this because, as the population continues to grow, and we're going to have to create more and more electricity, and even if we're generating it from renewable sources, the thing is the utilities are going to have to play a tremendous part of that, if probably more than half of that. And so, distributed sources are going to play a part of that, and maybe we'll see the value that the utility will start to change. So I think, and I'm hopeful that we'll see less of polluting generation sources, and that they will invest more and more wind and more solar and maybe biomass and other clean things. But you sort of hear this term like grid as a service, or making it that really the only part of the utility, and then people take into their own hands the aspects of the customer service aspect of it and the generation aspect of it, and those become then less centralized. But is the utility just going to go away, soon or overnight? Definitely not soon. Definitely not overnight. Do I think it's going to change, and do I think it has to? Yes. Yeah, for sure. And I think, but I really do honestly think we'll find a way to do that hand in hand. For the longest time, I think, the utilities and utility scale has sort of been, perceived as the enemy of distributed generation, but I don't. And again, even Elon Musk recently said he thinks the two will go hand in hand. But I think it's an exciting time in energy history because I think we're going to see some cool changes to where end-use customers are really going to be able to not only provide for their own energy needs, but also contribute to their local distributed grid as much as possible.
Yeah, great. But do you see that maybe communities, maybe not individuals, but more like communities of people with that have high solar or wind resource within their communities, do you think they'll start dropping off the grid as they are able to generate and as they're able to store better uh, energy from renewable sources?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. And I don't know how that sort of like, you may be familiar with like the Mueller neighborhood in Austin, or Miller neighborhood, I guess as it's now. They've got this Con Street project out there where, there's tons of solar and storage in that neighborhood, and they've got all these smart inverters, and I think they could potentially, go off grid because that community would sort of support everybody within their microgrid's needs. But that's obviously not that's not typical of just a sort of a modern neighborhood. I don't know. I think it'd be cool to see, but I think again, you still need the distributed grid, and so it's not entirely without utility unless they've built their own microgrid or their own distributed grid. I don't know how close we are to that. I don't know.
One last question before I let Wilson take over. What role do you see that? So I hear some talk about using electric vehicle batteries as storage, like kind of storage utility in a distributed sense. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that electric vehicles such as Teslas are going to play a big role in energy storage from renewables, distributed renewables in the future?
Yeah, so I know that one application that folks have is like, let's say you don't have a power wall at home, and you don't have, a storage device in your home, and your car is sitting there, and your solar panels are, generating electricity, and let's say you're not home. Ostensibly, you could use that to then directly charge the battery in your car, and, ostensibly say if you didn't need your car for a while, and the sun goes down, and, you could figure out a way to connect your car back into your home to the inverter. It could serve as your storage device rather than the power wall. But, really you want them all working together, which would really be the best, if that one is charging while the other is generating, while one is not needed. But yeah, I absolutely think you're going to start to see interdependence of, EVs and stationary storage, and then of course just whatever kind of distributed generation you got. Yeah, absolutely. Because that's the key, right? Is like, if you can figure out a way to sort of make it mobile, that's great. Because if you think about the amount of energy that we have in traditional just gasoline, the energy density within just a gallon of gasoline is tremendous if you think about it. How far a car can go on it, and so that's what's made it so valuable, and it's why we've invested so much in that. But I think as the technology gets better, again, sort of necessity being the mother of all invention, and we learn to harness that and make it more mobile, I absolutely do think we will get there. And I think we're going in that direction, especially when you look at sort of the new products that are coming out from Tesla and SolarCity.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, Tommy, we've got one more question. Thank you, Tim, for those great questions. That's Tim from here at UT. There's one more question in the chat window, and I'm not sure how how much or how easily you can answer this, but someone was curious about the SolarCity and Tesla merger, and what sort of effect that would have on the SolarCity operations, or sort of any at all.
Yeah, actually, I just got specific information on that I hadn't had the chance to study, but hang on a second, I will find it for you. So what Tesla has recently put out is that by joining forces, we can operate more efficiently and fully integrate our products while providing customers with an aesthetically beautiful and simple one-stop solar plus storage experience, which is basically just one installation, one service contract, and one phone app. So how will it affect operations? I think the idea is to just merge them and to streamline them really more than anything. So in jurisdictions like Hawaii, where kilowatt hour of electricity is really, really expensive, it's something like 3-4 times that of Texas. You have a lot of customers, and SolarCity has provided for them not only solar panels on the roof, but a solar hot water heater, plus energy efficiency services, plus the storage. And it's sort of the one-stop shop, and SolarCity will use the Tesla Powerwall. And so I think, the goal there is that, since we sort of have the common chairman and the companies are sister companies, I'm hopeful, and I think it's actually the hope of both companies, that it will make things even more smoothly, because I think at this point in time, if you reach out to Tesla just to get storage, or you reach out to SolarCity just to get solar, it's not necessarily quite the natural fit that your proposal or the person that is looking at your home to do the install will also have all of those components that I just mentioned in mind. And so I think that's the goal. And I think there's still some questions outstanding as to sort of what the company will be called, I think, and I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me on that. A lot of this has been unfolding lately. I actually think Tesla may have just posted some stuff just recently on its blog about how the companies will work together as they merge. But I think sorry to direct you to the website, but I think it might have some better information, frankly, than I do at this point in time on just how that merger will totally play out.
Well, great. We're sorry we kept you so long, but thank you so much for answering all these questions and for really giving a great and interesting talk. I'm from Florida myself, so I've been hammering the Amendment 1 news home to everybody that I can,
great.
because it really is so misleading. I was shocked when I read the sample ballot and how they framed it in such a way that it really kind of shook my belief in any of these amendments on you're like, wow.
Yeah, well, the good news is that they have to get 60% of the vote to pass that constitutional amendment, and the last poll that was released said they only had 40, and and it looks like every major newspaper in Florida has come out against it, really calling it out for what it is, which is basically just misleading. So I hope that's on our side, but I also read some publications that opponents of DG Solar had pumped a lot of money into communications and media supporting it. So yeah, one thing I found from my work in politics is that hearing from someone that like a friend or family member, is worth so much more, even if it's buzz from that person, than seeing it on a mail piece, or through somebody phone banking or through TV commercials. So yeah, please keep on getting the word out about that, because it's obviously been effective. It's been good.
All right. Well, we will let you go, and just wanted to thank you once again, Tommy, for the great talk. And please let us know if you'd ever like to give a follow up, because we're always interested in hearing more from you and folks in the industry.
Great. Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.